The morning sky over the Belgian hamlet of Villers-la-Faye was the colour of dirty snow, flat and indifferent. It was the second week of December in 1944, but the calendar hardly mattered anymore. Nothing had gone to plan. The infantrymen of the 22nd Armored Regiment had expected rest after the ceaseless push from Normandy, but instead they found themselves frozen into the Ardennes, parked in hedgerow country that seemed to swallow sound and hope in equal measure. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Corporal Edward Eddie Novak sat inside his M4 Sherman, chalky breath hanging in the stale air, waiting for coffee that never came. He was 21 years old, a welder's son from Toledo who had learned to trust the smallest details. A bead too hot, a seam too wide, ships leaked, boilers ruptured, steel betrayed its owner. Now he rode a tank that his crew called Hawkeye, though most days it felt more like a prayer than a weapon. The heater had broken somewhere near Mons, and the turret walls seemed to drink the cold. Wind slipped through the seams where the armour plates met, whispering around the ammunition racks. Novak had already done something that should have been against regulation. He knew it. He had stacked sandbags along the front glacis 60 in total, lashed with salvaged telephone wire. The bags bulged like tumorous growths, ugly and heavy. The turret ring could barely clear them when rotating. His lieutenant had called it superstition, but he didn't force Novak to remove them. The winter was too bitter, and the stories too heavy. Now, outside the village, an armoured column waited in uneasy silence. German guns had gone quiet during the night. Their absence felt like a warning. Somewhere beyond the tree line stood 88mm anti-tank guns, dug in, brushed with pine boughs, manned by crews who had spent years perfecting the art of slaughter. The Shermans would move at dawn. Inside the tank, Novak kept his gloves off long enough to feel the metal. Not the smooth steel of an engine block or ship hull, but something coarser, born of wartime speed. You could sense it under the paint. He touched the bolt heads along the interior, noting the vibration from the idling engine. The stories said that at the right angle, an 88 round could ignore thickness, shrug off slope, and turn a Sherman into a furnace. A spark of memory. The first briefing he ever heard in England, late in 1943. The major had spoken briskly, reading from notes. The M4, he announced, was the most versatile armoured vehicle in the world, a blend of firepower, reliability, and manoeuvrability that would outfight the Wehrmacht through sheer numbers and precision. Armour thickness was adequate, internal layout was proven. If the crew remained steady and employed combined arms doctrine, the Sherman would prevail in most engagements. No questions allowed. The crews listened, outwardly confident, but rumours had already crossed the Atlantic. In Tunisia, the 88mm guns had torn tanks apart from beyond visible range. In Italy, the same. The tank might be fast, but speed meant little when a crew never saw what killed them. Even in training, instructors had cautioned, never present a flat plate to the enemy. Always angle, always flank. Novak had nodded along. But back home, his father's voice echoed. Steel tells the truth when men won't. On a ridge near the village, an artillery forward observer raised binoculars. The sun was still low, a thin bruise on the horizon. The officer whispered into the handset, "Armour movement, grid 369. His words were swallowed by static. Inside Hawkeye, Novak heard the order to button up. He checked the sandbags again through the periscope. They were ugly. They made the tank look overweight, slow. But they had made sense to him. Sand absorbed. Sand dispersed heat and force. He had seen ship plating fracture from a boiler explosion. Had watched pressure rip metal like wet paper. Something had to absorb energy first. He wondered whether the 88's armour-piercing shell would behave differently if it struck through bags filled with earth rather than clean steel. The tank lurched forward. Tracks ground over frozen mud. The hedgerow opened, revealing a clearing dotted with low shrubs and skeletal trees. A small farmhouse burned near the road, its roof collapsed. Another crew had learned the truth here. The column advanced. The first explosion came from the left, an impact, not near but far, a probing shot. It struck a Sherman 2 vehicles ahead. No flame yet, just a ringing crack. The tank spun its turret but died before it could fire. The crew scrambled out, diving into the ditch. Another shot landed, then another. 88mm guns worked like snipers. They did not waste ammunition. They were patient. They measured, adjusted, and killed. The rounds were propelled at over 2,700 feet per second, enough to travel a mile in little more than a heartbeat. The German gunner scanned the column, searching for the heart of the formation. A third shot. Hawkeye shuddered. The crew yelled. Novak felt his throat tighten. The round had hit the sandbags fastened to the hull's right front. Instead of shearing through steel, it ruptured 3 bags, sending an upward plume of sand and cloth. But the armour held. The tank rocked back as though punched. Novak heard metallic ringing, the protest of steel under trauma. He waited for the familiar roar of fire, but it did not come. The gunner shouted, "We're alive!" The column began to pivot, guns seeking a vector. Another Sherman caught fire 50 yards away, its crew trapped inside. Flames licked the hatch seams. Novak heard one scream and then nothing. The sandbags had not saved that tank. The crew inside Hawkeye stared at one another, shaken but conscious. Novak could feel the strange quiet in their breath, disbelief mixed with terror. His lieutenant rapped his helmet once, then again. He wanted Novak's eyes. Novak looked up from the loader's station. "You think that would have gone through us without your bags?" Novak hesitated, unwilling to speak certainty. He was not an engineer. He was a welder's son. He had only the logic of heat and force. "I think it slowed it," he said. "Maybe broke it up." The lieutenant nodded and looked away. The tank retreated into the hedgerow, reversing so quickly that branches scraped the turret sides. The burning Sherman kept burning. They could do nothing for that crew. They were no longer a column, only scattered metal. Hours later, after artillery forced the 88s to withdraw, Novak examined the hull where the sandbags had taken the life. A blow. 3 bags were torn open, spilling sand into the seam between the glacis plate and the lower hull. Behind them, faint gouges marred the steel. If the round had landed half a foot higher, it might have bitten into the driver's compartment. The men gathered around, speaking in low tones. They would tell other crews, and those crews would tell others. Most changes in war spread not through doctrine, but through whispered stories, the kind that travelled faster than orders. News reached tank crews across the divisional front by nightfall. A Sherman with crude sandbag armour had survived an 88. That was enough. Facts followed belief, not the other way around. The next morning, Novak saw another tank festooned with bags like his own. The driver gave a sheepish salute as he passed, as if admitting an unspoken faith. This was how the practice began, not from command orders or studies, but from fear and the fragile hope that a few pounds of earth could tip the balance between life and annihilation. In England before the invasion, the doctrine had been clear. Armour served its purpose best when kept mobile. Additional weight meant slower advance, strained transmissions, and fuel trouble. The M4 had been designed to meet logistical reality mass production, reliability, ease of movement across poor roads. Every pound mattered. Sandbags were never part of the plan. Besides, armour thickness alone was never the Sherman's promise. It was an instrument of manoeuvre. Its primary virtues were dependability, ease of repair, and numbers. Strength in accumulation, quantity as a strategy. On paper, the calculus was simple. As long as replacement vehicles reached the front faster than they were lost, the Allies would maintain pressure. Paired with infantry, artillery, and air power, the M4 would succeed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The German doctrine was different. Their tanks were expressions of engineering pride, thick armour, complex optics, powerful guns, but they were few, slow to produce, and increasingly impossible to replace. The Allies believed their way was superior, and in many respects it was. But belief did little for a crew facing an ambush in a foggy Belgian field. The 88mm anti-aircraft gun had been an accident of history. Designed in the 1930s to shoot high-altitude bombers, it became an anti-tank weapon almost by chance during the Spanish Civil War. Once horizontal, its flat trajectory and high muzzle velocity made it lethal. In North Africa, against early Shermans, it became a reaper. Its armor-piercing shells could penetrate more than 4 inches of steel at long range. The Sherman's front hull was only a little under 2 inches thick. Yes, it was sloped, giving an effective resistance closer to 3 inches, but still far from enough. The 88 joked about angles. It ate geometry for breakfast. Crews knew the numbers. They learned them in England and repeated them in bivouac like catechism, as though reciting them could ward off the inevitable. But numbers were cold comfort compared to the story's accounts of tanks hit and burning before the gunshot was heard. Letters home spoke in careful euphemism, saying men were lost quickly, as though quickness were mercy. The sandbags were never part of Allied doctrine because doctrine assumed rational battle, combined arms, reconnaissance, artillery support. But by late 1944, rational battle had given way to chaos. The Ardennes made fools of plans. Roads clogged, snow muted supply lines. The German offensive pushed Allied armour into defensive postures where mobility was less relevant than survival. Sandbags suddenly made sense, and yet the practice had history well before the Ardennes. In the Mediterranean the previous year, tank crews in, Italy had begun experimenting with improvised armour, first spare track links, then sandbags. Their reasoning was simple. Anything was better than nothing. If a few feet of sand could slow a shell, maybe the flash and heat would dissipate before reaching ammunition racks. The Italian countryside offered abundant earth, and digging was free. There were early reports scattered, anecdotal of shells, striking sandbags and failing to penetrate. These accounts were quiet, overshadowed by louder truths. That tanks burned, that 88s killed. But the stories settled in the minds of men who understood that survival favoured the prepared. In Italy, the Ordnance Department had studied the practice briefly. They found little evidence that sandbags significantly improved protection. The shells travelling at such velocity tended to punch through rather than dissipate energy in soil. The extra weight also placed stress on suspensions. Their conclusion was simple: unnecessary, ineffective, inefficient. But those evaluations were conducted far from the front line. They did not account for the chaotic geometry of battle, the oblique angles, the deflected hits, the chance that a shell might strike where a sandbag had shifted or absorbed part of the force. On a long enough timeline, even superstition could save lives. The crews were unconvinced by official reports. They trusted friends more than engineers, and in war, belief often outran data. After the engagement near Villers-la-Faye, Novak's story spread. By week's end, dozens of tanks in his division bore sandbags. Some looked carefully stacked, others were haphazard, slung wherever they would fit. Telephone wire became precious. Farmhouses were raided not for valuables, but for burlap. In the long pauses between artillery bursts, men walked from tank to tank, comparing arrangements, arguing weight distribution, calculating whether 5 layers could be piled without obstructing the gun's depression. They spoke of sand as though it were talismanic. At night, the tanks sat like earthen mounds in the snow. Inside Hawkeye, Novak could not sleep. He kept replaying the impact, the flash of sand, not flame, the ringing vibration. He wondered whether their survival had been luck. If so, luck had picked an odd intermediary, dirt. Dirt from a Belgian ditch, stuffed into bags that once held grain. He thought of his father again, a man who taught him that no weld was perfect, that metal had moods, that the only sure thing was that no structure remained whole under enough stress. He imagined the 88 round meeting the sand, scattering grains, losing shape, losing heat. He imagined the steel plate beneath, bracing, but not surrendering. The thought felt childish and profound at once. Dawn came. They moved again. In the rear echelons, officers debated. Reports trickled in that sandbagged tanks were harder to destroy. Others countered with examples of catastrophic failure tanks with sandbags that still brewed up. No consensus emerged. The battlefield was not a laboratory. There were too many variables: angle of impact, range, shell type, luck, but the men at the front had already decided. Sandbags stayed, and so the Ardennes became a patchwork of improvised armour, a landscape where regulation surrendered to instinct. This shift from doctrine to adaptation revealed an unspoken truth about war, that survival often depends not on planned engineering, but on brave imagination. The men of the 22nd Armored Regiment went into the winter believing something new, that the earth itself could intercede against steel. They would soon face the moment that forced them to measure belief against reality again. The German 88 did not simply kill a tank, it unmade it. Crews spoke of hits so violent that the interior turned into a storm of shrapnel, flame, splinters of armour, and burning propellant. The round did not need to pass cleanly through, even a partial penetration could ignite the stored 75mm ammunition lining the interior walls of a Sherman. When that happened, the tank became a furnace. American soldiers had a term for it, brewing up, and even those who had never seen it firsthand had heard the stories whispered through the ranks. This was the terror that pushed American crews toward improvisation. They weren't engineers. They were farm boys from Kansas, machinists from Detroit, college dropouts from Boston. Yet when the official armour wasn't enough, they turned into inventors. If the book solution didn't exist, they made their own. Some began with extra track links. Others, scavengers by necessity, ripped broken armour plates off, destroyed tanks, American, British, even German. They welded anything that might slow a shot. Steel, lumber, spare wheels, crates filled with earth. And increasingly, the battlefield seemed to settle on one simple solution, the oldest material known to builders, a substance that could be filled, shaped, stacked, and replenished anywhere in Europe. Sand. No one remembers which crew did it first. Some say Italy, some say Normandy. Others swear it began with a single platoon who returned from a patrol shaken after seeing a panther punch through two Shermans as if they were made of tin. But by late 1944, sandbagged Shermans were everywhere, rumbling down roads with canvas sacks stitched to the hull, draped over the glacis, strapped atop the transmission housing, stacked around the bow gunner like some crude sarcophagus. A tank that already looked boxy and awkward now resembled a rolling bunker built by desperate men. One story repeated in letters, memoirs, and mess tent exaggerations tells of a lieutenant named Robert Bobby Mercer from the 4th Armoured Division. His tank, Lucky Millie, was crawling through apple orchards near Avranches when a tiger opened fire from a concealed tree line. Mercer spotted the muzzle flash too late. His driver was still shifting gears when the round struck. The crew braced for the end. Instead of slicing through the hull, the shell smashed into the wall of sandbags slung across the front. Dirt exploded outward like a volcanic blast. The tank rocked, and the men inside were thrown forward, but the steel behind the sand held. The shell had lost enough force to deform rather than penetrate. The Tiger fired again, shifting its aim to another Sherman. That second tank erupted in a hurricane of flame as its ammunition cooked off. Mercer's crew sat stunned, deafened, dust-covered, but alive. Later, after the Tiger withdrew, the lieutenant climbed out, stared at the mangled, leaking remains of his sandbag armour, and swore that without it, he and his crew would have been as dead as smoked hams. Was the tale embellished over time? Certainly. Soldiers tend to sharpen the edges of their memories. But the after-action reports that followed spoke of more than one supposedly fatal hit turned, survivable when sand was present. Whether chance, physics, or divine blessing, the men who rode inside Shermans began to believe that sandbags could mean the difference between going home in one piece or not going home at all. Of course, belief alone couldn't turn sand into armour, but it did have practical effects more than one might expect. Crews learned that a shaped charge warhead like the dreaded Panzerfaust lost much of its destructive power if it had to burn through sand before striking steel. The focused jet spread, diffused, and sometimes vaporized before reaching the hull. Even when heavy German guns fired solid shot, sand could force premature detonation, reducing the round's ability to penetrate. And, just as importantly, the layer of earth absorbed fragments that would otherwise ricochet inside the tank, killing men with shrapnel even if the armor itself wasn't catastrophically breached. No one claimed it was foolproof. No one thought sand magically stopped an 88, as if the laws of physics had been rewritten. But if the chance of survival increased by even a fraction, that was enough. Tankers lived by fractions. Not everyone approved. Senior officers, especially those concerned with speed and maneuver, were furious. The extra weight strained the Sherman's suspension and transmission, which were already pushed to their mechanical limits. The added mass slowed tanks on hills, bogged them in mud, and increased the likelihood of mechanical failure before the enemy ever fired a shot. General George S. Patton despised the practice. To him, tanks burdened with sandbags looked sloppy, unprofessional circus wagons, he called them. He ordered units to strip the bags immediately, insisting that better tactics, not improvised armor, should keep men alive. But Patton didn't ride inside those tanks. He didn't hear the hiss of a round tearing through the hull. He didn't see the aftermath when a Sherman brewed up, its turret blackened, its ammunition racks venting flame like chimney stacks. Men listened to Patton during inspections, nodded, saluted, and then, when night came, quietly put the sandbags back on, even if later historians would debate how much good the bags truly did. No argument, scientific or strategic, could erase what those men felt, that the sand gave them a fighting chance, a chance to shoot back, a chance to bail out, a chance to live. Over time, the practice spread so widely that it became part of the Sherman's silhouette in Europe. Photos show tanks rumbling past French villages, draped in what looks like crude masonry. Some carried neat wall-like rows of sacks. Others, less patient or more resourceful, tied them with fencing wire, crammed them beneath spare tracks, or stacked them inside wooden crates. There was a rough beauty in their desperation, an unspoken pact between crew and machine. If the Sherman could survive just one more hit, it meant one more day closer to victory, or a home, or simply tomorrow. Not every sandbag saved a life. Some tanks still brewed up, their crews scrambling through fire only to be cut down by machine gun bursts in the next field. Some tank destroyers, lacking turrets and carrying lighter armor, tried sandbagging as well, with limited success. The men still died. The war still took its price. And yet the belief remained that somewhere in those sacks of French earth lay a thin line between oblivion and survival. That if fate allowed, sand might stand where steel failed. By the winter of 1944-45, the sight was common across the European theatre. Shermans hunched beneath dirty canvas bags, no two alike, each telling a story of fear, ingenuity, and stubborn hope. Commanders wrote memos complaining. Supply officers cursed the misuse of bags that were supposed to hold grain or cement. Mechanics warned of broken suspensions. The tankers didn't care. They welded, tied, stacked, and improvised. Because they knew not in theory, but in blood, that each extra layer, no matter how crude, increased the odds. That was enough. Those sandbagged Shermans rolled across France and Belgium, through the forests of the Ardennes and into Germany itself. Many died, many survived, and in their wake remained the memory of crews who took the tools and materials at hand and reshaped their fragile steel homes into something just a little more forgiving, a little more merciful, a little more like armor, even if that armor was made from nothing more than dirt and faith. The longer the war dragged on, the more the Sherman changed, not just in its factories, but on the very roads and hedgerows where it fought. Its story was not written solely by the engineers in Detroit or Lima, but by the men who lived inside the tank's steel ribs. They shaped it with whatever they could find, one weld, one bolt, one sandbag at a time. Sandbags were only the beginning. As crews studied the wreckage of their own machines, they noticed something curious. Spare track links often welded to the hull, purely to be convenient, Replacements sometimes absorbed the first impact of a shot. The steel was not special. It was simply another layer, another obstacle that might rob a shell of its full killing strength before it struck the armor beneath. Soon, spare track links were no longer mere spares. They were armor. Crews raided depots, workshops, and the skeletal frames of their own dead tanks. They welded track across the nose of the hull, up the sides, across the turret cheek, anywhere an enemy gunner was likely to aim. Some tanks emerged looking almost reptilian, coated in thick metal scales. No two looked alike. One had a single row of track around the driver's hatch. Another had so many plates on its nose that it seemed like a monster stitched together from fallen brethren. When fresh tracks ran short, they scavenged from Panthers, Panzers, anything German and metal and lying still. One tanker joked that his Sherman wore a panther's jaw like a necklace. It was not pretty, but it worked often enough that no one laughed. These modifications weren't merely acts of desperation, they were acts of understanding. By then, tank crews knew exactly what killed them, that the first hit often decided everything. If the armor could blunt that first blow, even slightly, then the crew had a chance to respond to fire, reverse, or escape. In war, the smallest chance becomes sacred. The army noticed. It took time filled with casualties, field reports, and stubborn persistence, but eventually, the higher command began to accept what the men already knew. Armor, even improvised armor, mattered. Before long, official kits of additional plates began to arrive in Europe, intended to reinforce weaker points on the tank, the front hull, the turret cheek, the sponsons. These weren't elegant. They were slabs of metal rectangular, rough, bolted directly onto the Shermans. Skin. To a civilian eye, it looked like crude welding. To a tanker, it looked like survival. Some divisions modified their tanks so aggressively that by the Battle of the Bulge, they hardly resembled factory models at all. They carried logs strapped to the hull, sandbags in wooden frames, track links welded in great mosaics, spare wheels bolted like makeshift shields. They were Frankensteins of steel field-born creatures whose only purpose was to endure, and endure they did. Still, the Germans remained terrifying opponents. In the Ardennes, Panthers lurked like wolves, waiting for Shermans to reveal themselves on icy roads or snowy fields. Their long 75mm guns could reach out across distances that made the battlefield feel unfair, like archers firing on men with spears. One tank commander in the 2nd Armored Division described it simply, "You never saw the Panther first, you just saw what it did." And yet Sherman crews learned to fight smarter. They ambushed, flanked, being called artillery, and used smoke. They fought as teams, not lone warriors. The Sherman's greatest strength was not its armor, nor its gun, but its reliability and the speed with which it could be repaired and returned to the front. It was always there, always moving, always pushing. Even so, the men wanted more protection. That desire, unquenchable, stubborn, pushed the army itself to evolve the design. From that pressure came a machine that looked like a Sherman, but felt different. Heavier, broader, steadier. The M4A3E8, known as the Easy 8. It rode on a new suspension that handled rough terrain better and carried more weight without complaint. Crews added sandbags, track links, welded plates, but the tank felt less strained. It seemed made to grow. Heavier still was the assault variant, the M4A3E2 Jumbo. Its frontal armor was so thick it could shrug off hits that would have gutted earlier Shermans. Jumbos became the spearheads during assaults, rolling forward to draw fire from Panthers and Tigers while other Shermans maneuvered for the kill. To the men who had once stacked sandbags out of desperation, the Jumbo felt like a whispered promise from the factories back home. "We heard you. We're trying." Even that wasn't the end. Some field workshops increased the Jumbo's armor even further, welding on thick plates scavenged from wherever they could find them, abandoned hulls, destroyed bridges, even scrap meant for construction. One celebrated tank, nicknamed Cobra King, led the breakthrough to Bastogne during the Bulge, its armor so reinforced that it seemed practically invincible. It was not invincible, of course. No tank is. But it was enough, and enough is a word that carries weight in war. As the Allies pushed deeper into Germany, the Shermans rolled through shattered towns and winter forests, through river valleys and past burned-out German armour. They were still vulnerable, painfully so, yet their crews had changed. They had learned to live with fragility, to counter fear with ingenuity. They had turned canvas bags, track links, and scrap steel into armour, not just for their machines, but for their spirits. Somewhere along the way, the Sherman ceased to be merely a vehicle. It became a companion, a shaky protector, a battered hope. A tanker in the 3rd Armoured Division once wrote home, "Our tank is ugly. She's patched with parts from old friends. She leaks oil and smells of fuel. But as long as she moves, she is life. We treat her better than ourselves." That was the heart of the Sherman, not the armour thickness or the gun velocity, but the bond between a machine and the crew that coaxed it through fire. In time, the sandbags slowly disappeared. They were heavy, cumbersome, and dangerous when wet. The newer wet stowage ammunition racks reduced internal fires, and the later tanks had better armour built in. But for that brief, brutal chapter in Europe, sandbags represented the soul of American armour, resourceful, stubborn, unorthodox, willing to try anything if it meant seeing another dawn. Later, analysts would debate whether sandbags made real difference, whether they truly stopped an 88 or merely offered comfort. Some argued the protection was psychological. Others pointed to real battlefield accounts of deflected hits. But those arguments miss the point. For the men inside the tank, survival was not theory. It was not math. It was the desperate hope that anything might intercede between them and the scorching bite of German steel. And in that hope, they found courage. Because sandbags were more than improvised armour. They were a statement. We know what hunts us. We know the odds. We refuse to die without trying. In the end, that spirit mattered as much as any plate of steel. The tanker's war was not clean. It was not grand. It was hard, grinding steel against steel, fear against courage. And through it all, the Sherman, humble, mocked, beloved, carried its crews from Normandy's hedgerows to Germany's heart. Many did not return, but many did. And among those who survived, more than a few swore quietly, almost sheepishly, that maybe, just maybe, the sandbags helped. If not in stopping shells, then in steadying hearts. And sometimes, in war, that is enough. As the skies cleared day after day, the Luftwaffe tried to contest the air, but it was a pale shadow of what it once was. A few German fighters streaked across the clouds, but most were hunted down before they ever reached the front. The Americans joked darkly that the war in the air was becoming a turkey shoot. On the ground, the roads were still clogged with frozen wreckage. Burned tanks sat in ditches, their tracks blown apart, their turrets black with soot. The trees were splintered from shell fire, an entire forest scarred. Patrols advanced through the Ardennes, one hedgerow at a time. It was slow, brutal work. German snipers lurked in the highest branches, firing single shots that cut men down without warning. Sometimes the enemy surrendered in groups, stumbling forward with their hands raised, hollow-eyed and starving. Other times, they fought to the last bullet, refusing to yield even when completely surrounded. The cold never let up. Some soldiers said the snow felt like an enemy of its own, an invisible one that always took a little piece of you. Frostbite gnawed at fingers and toes. Rifle bolts froze. A machine gun jammed just once could cost a squad their lives. But the Americans kept pushing. More reinforcements arrived. Tanks with whitewash camouflage, fresh infantry with clean boots, artillery rolling up on sleds because the wheels locked in the cold. Mixed among them were veterans who had survived North Africa and Normandy. They moved with a quiet confidence, their faces lined with a hardness that winter could not freeze. Near Bastogne, the 101st Airborne held firm. They had been surrounded for days, starving, low on ammunition. When the Germans demanded surrender, the reply was a single word: nuts. The paratroopers laughed about it only later. At the time, They were too busy fighting for every tree trunk. Roadblocks made from overturned trucks and snowdrifts became fortresses. Foxholes were chewed deeper every night. Some were reinforced with doors ripped from ruined houses. The men slept curled under blankets, stiff with frost, boots on, rifles cradled against their chests. Every morning, the Germans tried again. The sound of their artillery came first, a distant growl that grew into a deafening scream as shells crashed among the trees, showering splinters like steel needles. Then the infantry came, grey shapes moving low across the snow. The paratroopers held. When the line buckled, someone always plugged the gap, an anti-tank gun rolling forward, a squad of riflemen launching a countercharge, a medic dragging the wounded back through the chaos. At night, the sky flickered orange from burning villages. The snow glowed eerily in the firelight, and the forest shadows danced like ghosts. The worst part wasn't the fighting. It was the waiting hours spent listening for footsteps that never came, or worse, footsteps that crept close enough that you could hear Germans speaking softly just a few trees away. But then came thunder from a distant road, the unmistakable clatter of heavy tracks. Rumours flew. Tanks were coming. No one knew whose they were. Minutes stretched. Then a cheer ripped across the American lines as the first Shermans appeared, roaring out of the haze. Behind them came armoured cars, infantry in long columns, supply trucks bursting with crates. Patton's Third Army had broken through. The siege of Bastogne was over. Men who had not smiled in days now grinned through cracked lips. Some cried without shame. Others simply sat down where they stood, too tired to speak. But the war did not stop for relief. Orders came quickly. Advance. The Americans pushed outward from Bastogne, smashing into German positions already shaken by the sudden break. Villages captured days earlier were retaken. Roads, once claimed by panzers, were now guarded by American armour and artillery. The bulge, once a deep wound in the Allied line, began to shrink. German units, low on fuel and hope, began to withdraw. Some commanders burned vehicles rather than let them be captured. Infantry marched east with frost-bitten feet, leaving bloody prints in the snow. Still, many fought to the end. As January rolled in, the Americans pressed toward the original front line. Snowstorms returned, thick and relentless. It felt as if the Ardennes was trying to swallow the armies once more. Yet nothing, not the cold, not the fog, not the exhaustion, could stop their advance. When the last German troops pulled back beyond the starting point of their attack, the forest fell quiet again. Trees stood like solemn witnesses over a land littered with steel and bone. The once bright white snow was stained with smoke and ash. The Ardennes, beautiful and brutal, had taken its toll. The bulge had finally closed, but no one who walked through those woods would ever forget it. When the guns finally grew distant, and the Ardennes woods settled into a sombre stillness, the soldiers barely recognized the silence. It felt unnatural, like the land itself was holding its breath. Trees that had survived the storm stood blackened, their branches sheared or hanging like broken limbs. Snow covered everything, foxholes, tank tracks, even bodies that no one had yet reached. The living walked among the frozen stillness, searching for what remained of their companies. Some names were spoken, others swallowed. A boot here, a torn patch there, sometimes all that was left to remember a friend. Corpsmen moved carefully, checking for any faint breath, but most faces were still and pale beneath the frost. Stretchers became scarce, so the doors pulled from shattered homes became makeshift carriers. For others, there was no carrying at all, just a quiet note in a frozen notebook and a rifle planted in the snow above them. Survivors rotated back to ruined villages that had become holding grounds for the broken. The walls there were patched with blanket cloth, windows closed with crates, and every floor smelled of damp wool and wood smoke. Even with the battle over, cold still claimed men. Some slipped into hypothermia overnight, never waking again. A handful of soldiers found themselves staring at captured German equipment, sleek Panthers and Tigers, some abandoned intact. They ran their hands along the armour, marvelling at its thickness, wondering how they ever destroyed machines built so precisely. Others, still angry, spat on the steel and walked away. As the Americans advanced into what had been German rear positions, they found fuel drums frozen solid, half-eaten rations scattered in panic, and sleds loaded with big supplies for units that never arrived. The fire-blackened remains of documents burned in snow pits told the story of a retreat written too quickly. Locals, those who had survived, made hesitant returns to their villages. Old men, mothers, and children stepped into rubble that had once been their homes. They searched through ashes for any memory worth keeping: a tin cup, a wooden toy, a wedding ring that had somehow endured heat and time. Soldiers helped where they could, sharing rations and blankets, though most had little to give but their hands. With the roads open again, long convoys rolled through the Ardennes, engines droning like a mechanical river. Fresh troops watched the shattered forest from their trucks, hearing whispered stories of what had happened there, how the panzers had come like thunder, how the line bent but never quite snapped. Their faces held awe and dread in equal measure. At night, around cook fires, veterans of the Bulge spoke softly. They talked about friends who were gone, about the cold that punished the bones, about the moment when every man thought they were finished, yet somehow kept going. They spoke of small mercies, warm gloves traded, a pocket Bible, a tin of coffee shared with a stranger. These stories travelled faster than orders, becoming the legend of a battle won not by power, but by endurance. A chaplain walked from group to group, saying quiet prayers. He offered no grand sermons, only hands folded with theirs, standing beside the grief rather than above it. He blessed the dead where they lay and whispered comfort over the living who felt their hearts still trapped in the frozen woods. Replacements arrived steadily, young and uncertain. They asked what to expect. The veterans gave simple advice: keep your socks dry, stay with your squad, don't trust the quiet. Beyond that, there were no lessons that words could teach. Gradually, units were rotated out toward new fronts. Wagons and trucks loaded with equipment rumbled eastward. Some men left limping, others with bandages wrapped over eyes or hands, still others hollowed in silence. No one departed unchanged. The Ardennes was left scarred fields torn by craters, forests splintered, rivers blackened with oil. It would take decades for the land to heal, though some say it never truly did. Beneath the new snowfall, metal, bone, and memory slept together. As news of the victory spread, newspapers back home celebrated a turning point. Families clung to hope as telegrams arrived, some bearing joy, others shattering entire households with a single sentence beginning with regret. Mothers opened letters written weeks before, smiling at jokes from sons who would never return. The soldiers who remained looked east. The war was not yet finished. Rumour spoke of rivers, bridges, and the German heartland beyond. They packed their gear without ceremony, shouldered rifles still cold to the touch, and marched onward. For them, the Bulge was a chapter but not the end. The end still waited across a shattered continent. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.